A homeless man in a torn wheelchair entered a billionaire's company, and everyone froze. But when the CEO crossed the lobby, knelt beside him, and embraced him in silence, the world stopped watching and started listening. No one knew who he was, but from that day forward everything began to change. This is a story of dignity rediscovered, of voices long ignored finally being heard, and of one man who proved that purpose doesn't vanish, it waits to be seen. Get ready. This one will stay with you for a long, long time. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us where you're watching from. Sometimes kindness appears in the most unexpected places, changing not just one life, but an entire world. The rain fell in sheets across the city, transforming the early evening light into a blur of reflections and shadows. Buildings became watercolor paintings, their edges softening against the darkening sky. On the corner of Avenida Libertador and Calle Soledad, beneath the twisted branches of a jacaranda tree, Eduardo Morales adjusted the tarp that protected his few possessions. His weathered hands, once steady enough to trace the finest architectural details, now trembled slightly as he secured the plastic against the wind. Across the street, the Torreon building rose 68 stories of glass and steel into the clouds, its lights burning despite the hour. It housed the headquarters of Grupo Vitalex, one of the country's most powerful corporations. To Eduardo, it represented everything beyond his reach: shelter, security, significance. From his position beneath the jacaranda, he could see the revolving doors spinning, disgorging men and women in tailored suits who rushed to waiting cars, their umbrellas unfurled against the deluge. Eduardo's wheelchair, a patchwork creation of salvaged parts and ingenuity, sat beside him, its right wheel slightly bent from an encounter with a careless taxi driver 3 weeks earlier. He'd named it Quixote for its tendency to tilt at invisible windmills, veering left when he wanted to go straight. The chair was, like him, broken but functional, persisting despite its obvious flaws. "Another day in paradise," he murmured, his voice almost lost in the percussion of rain against tarp. From a weatherproof case beside him, Eduardo withdrew a piece of cardboard and a stick of charcoal. Despite the dimming light and the moisture in the air, his fingers itched to create. It was the one thing that still connected him to who he once was, Professor Eduardo Morales, whose lectures on existential philosophy had once filled auditoriums. Now his audience consisted of hurried pedestrians who rarely spared him a glance. As the rain intensified, a sleek black car pulled up to the entrance of the Torreon. Eduardo watched as a security detail emerged, umbrellas at the ready, and then he appeared. Mateo Vidal, founder and CEO of Grupo Vitalex. Unlike the others, Vidal didn't rush. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew the world would wait for him. Even from a distance, Eduardo could see the weight of responsibility in his posture, the solitude that surrounded him, despite the entourage. Without conscious thought, Eduardo began to sketch. The charcoal moved across the damp cardboard, capturing not just the man's features, but the isolation that emanated from him. In Vidal's eyes, Eduardo recognized something familiar, a loneliness he understood all too well. For 15 minutes, Eduardo worked in silence, the rain providing a rhythmic backdrop to his creation. When he finished, he studied the portrait critically. It wasn't his best work. The cardboard had warped with moisture, and the light had been poor. But he had captured something essential. In the drawing, Vidal wasn't the untouchable billionaire. He was simply a man, carrying an invisible burden. Eduardo placed the sketch under his tarp and closed his eyes, listening to the city's heartbeat beneath the rain. He didn't notice when the revolving doors spun again, when a figure crossed the street, or when someone stopped beside his makeshift shelter. "Excuse me?" The voice startled Eduardo. He opened his eyes to find an umbrella held over him, and beneath it, a young woman in a corporate suit, her ID badge identifying her as Grupo Vitalex staff. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, "but I'm looking for the man who draws. I've been told he stays here." Eduardo nodded cautiously. "That would be me." She smiled, relief evident in her expression. "My name is Lucia Mendez. I work for Mr. Vidal." She gestured toward the Torreon. "He saw one of your drawings, a portrait of a flower vendor on the plaza. He was quite moved by it and asked me to find you." Eduardo raised an eyebrow. "Find me?" "He'd like to commission a portrait," Lucia explained. "Would you be willing?" The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Eduardo. 5 years on the street and suddenly one of the country's wealthiest men wanted his art. "Why not?" Eduardo replied with a slight shrug. "Though I don't think my usual studio is quite up to receiving such an important client." Lucia's smile widened at his dry humor. "Mr. Vidal suggested you might come to the Torreon. Tomorrow at 2? She held out a business card. "Ask for me at reception." After she left, Eduardo sat motionless, the card between his fingers feeling somehow heavier than it should. The rain continued to fall, but the world had subtly shifted on its axis. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the previous day's storm leaving behind a freshly rinsed city. Eduardo woke early, as he always did, his body stiff from another night on hard ground. The jacaranda above him had begun to bloom, pale purple flowers dotting its branches like hesitant stars. He performed his morning ritual with methodical precision, washing at a public fountain, changing into his cleanest shirt, and combing his silver-streaked hair. Once he had been particular about his appearance. The years on the street had eroded that vanity, but today he found himself caring again. By 1:30, Eduardo had positioned himself across from the Torreon, his wheelchair freshly oiled, his drawing materials organized in a battered leather satchel that had once held academic papers. He studied the building, its gleaming facade reflecting clouds and sky, and felt a flutter of anxiety. It had been years since he'd entered such a place, years since he'd been anywhere except on the margins. "Oh, you're just going to draw a picture," he told himself. Nothing more. But as he rolled toward the entrance, Eduardo couldn't help but feel he was crossing more than just a street. The security guards at the door eyed him with suspicion as he approached. Eduardo saw their hands move subtly toward their radios, saw the way their postures stiffened. He was familiar with that reaction, the instinctive distrust of the disheveled, the disabled, the different. "I have an appointment," Eduardo said, producing Lucia's card. "Lucia Mendez is expecting me." The guards exchanged glances, doubt evident in their expressions. "Wait here," one said, taking the card and disappearing inside. Eduardo waited, acutely aware of how out of place he looked against the polished marble and glass. Pedestrians gave him a wide berth as they entered and exited, some casting curious glances, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. It was a dance Eduardo knew well, the choreography of discomfort that surrounded those who didn't fit. Minutes passed, stretching into discomfort. Eduardo began to wonder if this had been some elaborate joke, or perhaps a misunderstanding. Just as he was considering leaving, the door opened, and Lucia emerged, slightly breathless. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," she said. "Please, come in." As Eduardo rolled through the doors, he entered a world he had almost forgotten existed. The lobby of the Torreon soared 3 stories high, all marble and light. A massive sculpture dominated the center, abstract steel forms that reached toward the skylight above. People moved purposefully across the space, their shoes clicking against the polished floor. Conversations faltered as Eduardo passed. He felt the weight of stairs, heard the whispers. His wheelchair, with its mismatched wheels and duct-taped armrests, stood in stark contrast to the sleek perfection of the surroundings. Lucia led him to a private elevator at the rear of the lobby. "Mr. Vidal's office is on the 68th floor," she explained as they entered. "He's in meetings until 2:30, but he asked that I get you settled in the conference room adjacent to his office. Is there anything you need for your work?" Eduardo shook his head. "Just good light." The elevator rose swiftly, Eduardo's stomach lurching slightly at the speed. Through the glass walls he watched the city shrink beneath them, buildings transforming into miniatures, streets into ribbons. It had been so long since he'd seen the world from above. "It's quite a view," Lucia remarked, following his gaze. "Yes," Eduardo agreed softly. "It makes everything look different." When they reached the executive floor, Lucia guided him through a series of corridors, past offices where people looked up curiously from their work. Finally, they arrived at a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Will this do?" she asked. Eduardo nodded, momentarily speechless. The room was flooded with natural light, the view encompassing not just the business district, but beyond to the mountains that cradled the city. From this height, he could see the contrast between the modern towers and the colonial architecture of the old town, the green expanses of the parks, and in the distance the shimmering blue of the ocean. "It's perfect," he said finally. Lucia smiled. "I'll leave you to set up. There's water and coffee on the sideboard. Mr. Vidal will join you shortly." Once alone, Eduardo moved to the windows, gazing down at the world below. Somewhere down there was his jacaranda tree, his corner, his life reduced to a speck from this height. The thought was both humbling and oddly liberating. He was arranging his materials on the conference table when the door opened. Eduardo turned, expecting Lucia, but instead found himself face to face with Mateo Vidal. In person, Vidal was less imposing than his public image suggested. Of medium height, with salt and pepper hair and intelligent eyes, he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than flamboyance. His suit, while obviously expensive, was understated, his only concession to wealth a simple platinum watch. "Mr. Morales," Vidal said, crossing the room with an extended hand. "Thank you for coming." Eduardo blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" A small smile touched Vidal's lips. "I make it my business to know things." He gestured to the chair opposite Eduardo. "May I?" Eduardo nodded, suddenly aware of the disparity between them. The billionaire CEO and the homeless artist, sitting across from each other as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I saw your work quite by accident," Vidal began. "A sketch of Maria, the flower vendor from Plaza Bolivar. You captured something in her face, a dignity, a resilience. It made me curious about the artist." "Maria has been selling flowers for 30 years, Eduardo said. "She raised 5 children on those sales. There's a lifetime of stories in her face." Vidal nodded. "And you saw that, when most people see only an old woman with flowers." He paused. "That's a rare gift, Mr. Morales." Eduardo shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "What kind of portrait did you have in mind, Mr. Vidal?" "Please call me Mateo." Vidal leaned back in his chair. "As for the portrait, I'm not sure. Something honest, I suppose. Most of my portraits are corporate affairs, designed to convey power, success. I'm curious what you might see." For the next hour they talked. Vidal spoke of his company, its history, its future plans. Eduardo listened, asking occasional questions, observing the way Vidal's expression changed when discussing different aspects of his work. When Vidal mentioned a childhood in one of the city's working-class neighborhoods, Eduardo detected a subtle shift in his accent, a momentary return to earlier speech patterns. Throughout their conversation, Eduardo's charcoal moved across the paper, capturing not just features but essence, the tension in Vidal's shoulders when discussing board meetings, the softening around his eyes when mentioning his mother, the slight defensive tilt of his chin when referring to criticism of his company's policies. "You're not what I expected," Vidal said during a pause. Eduardo glanced up. "And what did you expect?" "I'm not sure. But you speak like someone who's had an education." Eduardo's hand stilled momentarily. "We all have pasts, Mr. Vidal. Some of us just have more dramatic falls." Something flickered in Vidal's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He checked it with a frown. "I'm afraid I have to cut this short. An unexpected situation requires my attention." Eduardo nodded, beginning to gather his materials. "I can finish from memory." "No," Vidal said quickly. "I'd like to continue. Are you available tomorrow, same time?" The question caught Eduardo off guard. "I don't exactly have a busy social calendar." Vidal smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "Tomorrow, then." After Vidal left, Lucia returned to escort Eduardo back down. As they waited for the elevator, she glanced at his sketch. "That's remarkable," she said softly. "You've captured him in a way I've never seen before." Eduardo looked down at the drawing. In it, Vidal sat not behind a desk or against a corporate backdrop, but in a simple chair, his expression thoughtful, almost vulnerable. It was Vidal the man, not Vidal the CEO. "Everyone has layers," Eduardo replied. "Most people just never get past the first one." As he rolled out of the Torreon and back toward his corner, Eduardo felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, fleeting, but undeniable. For a brief moment, he had been seen not as an object of pity or discomfort, but as a person of value. The feeling sustained him through the night, through the chill that settled after sunset, through the distant sounds of the city's nightlife. And when morning came, Eduardo found himself looking forward to the day ahead, a novel sensation that was both welcome and terrifying in its fragility. What Eduardo couldn't know as he prepared for his second visit to the Torreon was that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The portrait he was creating would become not just an image, but a catalyst. The first brushstroke in a much larger canvas that would eventually encompass not just 2 lives, but an entire community. And it all began with a simple act of seeing. The second session with Vidal flowed more easily than the first. There was less formality between them, the natural barrier of status beginning to erode in the face of genuine conversation. Eduardo learned that Vidal had built his company from scratch, transforming a small technology firm into a conglomerate that now employed thousands. Vidal, in turn, discovered that Eduardo had once been a professor of philosophy, specializing in existentialism and ethics. "What happened?" Vidal asked, the question direct but not unkind. Eduardo's hand paused over the paper. 5 years, and still the story caught in his throat like a barbed hook. "A car accident," he said finally. "I was driving home from the university. A truck crossed the median. The official report said the driver fell asleep." He shrugged, a gesture meant to appear casual, but which betrayed tension in every line. "My wife, Elena, died instantly. I survived, minus the use of my legs and with some other complications." Vidal's expression remained neutral, though his eyes reflected understanding. "And your career? Medical bills, rehabilitation attempts, insurance that covered far less than promised." Eduardo's charcoal moved again, decisive strokes shaping Vidal's jawline. "The university was supportive at first, but budgets tightened, accommodations became challenging, and eventually my position was eliminated. Restructuring, they called it. And family? Friends?" Eduardo smiled thinly. "You ask a lot of questions for someone getting his portrait drawn." "Professional hazard," Vidal replied. "I've built a career on curiosity. My parents are gone. Elena's family is in Spain. As for friends..." Eduardo paused. "Tragedy has a way of sorting those. Some stay. Most drift away, uncomfortable with what they can't fix." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft scratch of charcoal against paper. Outside the windows, clouds drifted across the mountains, casting moving shadows over the city below. "My father was a factory worker," Vidal said suddenly. 32 years at Industrias Nacionales. When they automated his department, they let him go. 3 months before his pension would have vested." Eduardo looked up, surprised by the personal revelation. "He never recovered from it," Vidal continued. "Not financially, though that was difficult enough, but spiritually. They took more than his job, they took his sense of worth." Their eyes met across the table, a moment of unexpected connection. "That's why I started this company the way I did," Vidal said, "with certain promises. No automation without retraining, no dismissals without transition support, no corporate decisions that ignore human cost." "Noble ideals," Eduardo remarked. "Do they survive in practice?" A shadow crossed Vidal's face. "Not always as I'd hope. The larger we grow, the harder it becomes to maintain those principles. Shareholders demand returns. Executives argue for efficiency. The market rewards certain behaviors and punishes others. The eternal tension between ethics and economics." "Exactly." Vidal leaned forward, animated now. "You understand it academically. I live it daily. The constant balance between what's profitable and what's right." For the next hour, their conversation ranged widely, from corporate responsibility to the nature of dignity, from market forces to the meaning of work. Eduardo found himself engaged intellectually in a way he hadn't been since his teaching days, his mind stretching to meet Vidal's questions and challenges. When Lucia appeared to remind Vidal of his next appointment, both men seemed surprised by how quickly the time had passed. "I've enjoyed our conversation," Vidal said as he rose to leave. "Would you be willing to return once more to complete the portrait?" Eduardo nodded. "Of course." After Vidal departed, Eduardo remained in the conference room, adding details to the portrait from memory. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Lucia watching him from the doorway. "You've made quite an impression," she said, startling him. Eduardo looked up. "I doubt that." Lucia entered the room, stopping beside him to study the portrait. "Mr. Vidal doesn't usually spend this much time with anyone, especially not someone he's just met, and he certainly doesn't share personal stories about his father." Eduardo shrugged. People often confide in strangers. There's safety in the transience of the connection. Is that what this is, a transient connection? The question hung in the air, more pointed than Lucia perhaps intended. Eduardo considered it seriously, remembering the ease of their conversation, the unexpected resonances between their experiences. Most connections are transient, he said finally. Some just take longer to fade than others. Lucia regarded him thoughtfully. You're very cynical for an artist, and you're very perceptive for an assistant. She smiled at that. I'm actually not his assistant. I'm director of community engagement. My job is to help the company connect with the communities where we operate. A corporate conscience, then. Sometimes, she admitted. Though Mr. Vidal needs less reminding than most CEOs. As Lucia escorted him back to the lobby, Eduardo found himself curious about her. How long have you worked here? 3 years. I started as an intern while finishing my degree in social development. Mr. Vidal offered me a position after I presented a rather critical analysis of the company's community impact. Eduardo raised an eyebrow. He hired you for criticizing him? He said he needed people who would tell him the truth, not what he wanted to hear. She smiled. It's one of his better qualities. At the entrance, Lucia hesitated. Mr. Morales, where exactly do you stay? The question was delicately phrased, but Eduardo recognized the concern behind it. I have a spot near Parque Libertad, under a jacaranda tree. Very scenic. Lucia frowned. It's supposed to rain again tonight. Rain is just nature's way of telling us we're not as in control as we think we are. Eduardo adjusted his satchel. I've survived worse. As he rolled away from the Torreon, Eduardo could feel Lucia's gaze following him. Her concern was well-intentioned but unnecessary. He had learned to endure discomfort, to find small pleasures in a life stripped of luxuries. A little rain wouldn't kill him. But that night, as the promised storm broke over the city, Eduardo found himself thinking about the warmth of the Torreon, about conversations that challenged his mind, about being seen as something more than an object of pity. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps there might be a different kind of life waiting somewhere, not a return to what was lost, but something new, something yet to be discovered. The third session with Vidal was scheduled for the following week. In the days between, Eduardo continued his usual routine, sketching tourists in the plaza, selling small drawings to passers-by, surviving on the margins of a city that barely acknowledged his existence. But something had shifted within him. The conversations with Vidal had awakened dormant parts of his mind, re-engaged his intellectual curiosity. On the morning of their final session, Eduardo arrived at the Torreon to find an unusual level of activity. Security was heightened, staff moved with greater urgency, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been present before. At reception, he was greeted not by Lucia but by a stern-faced man in a suit who introduced himself as Carlos Delgado, head of security. Mr. Morales, Delgado said, his tone formal. I understand you have an appointment with Mr. Vidal. Eduardo nodded. For the final sitting. I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. Mr. Vidal is unavailable due to an emergency board meeting. Disappointment washed over Eduardo, though he kept his expression neutral. I see. Should I reschedule? Delgado hesitated. Mr. Vidal left instructions. He asked that you wait in his private office. The meeting may run late, but he's determined to keep your appointment. This was unexpected. Eduardo followed Delgado to the executive elevator, aware of the curious glances from staff members. The security chief's stiff posture and tight expression suggested he didn't entirely approve of Vidal's instructions. Is everything all right? Eduardo asked as they ascended. Delgado's jaw tightened. Just corporate matters. The evasive answer told Eduardo more than a direct response might have. Something significant was happening, something that had the entire building on edge. Vidal's office occupied the northeast corner of the 68th floor, with panoramic views of both the city and the mountains beyond. Unlike the stark minimalism Eduardo had expected, the space was warm and personal. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not with corporate trophies but with actual books, their spines showing signs of use. Art from local artists hung on the walls, and a small collection of stones and fossils was arranged on a side table. Please make yourself comfortable, Delgado said, gesturing to a sitting area near the windows. Mr. Vidal will join you when he can. After Delgado left, Eduardo rolled to the windows, gazing out at the city spread below. From this height, he could see his usual spot beneath the jacaranda tree, now just a tiny splash of purple against the urban landscape. The perspective was disorienting, his entire world reduced to a speck, viewed from a place he'd never imagined he'd be. Turning from the window, Eduardo explored the office, drawn to the bookshelves. The collection was eclectic: philosophy, history, science, literature. Many volumes were well worn, with bookmarks protruding or corners turned down. Eduardo ran his fingers along the spines, stopping when he recognized a familiar title, Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre. It had been one of his core texts when teaching. Curious, he pulled the book from the shelf and opened it. Inside, the margins were filled with neat annotations in a precise hand. Vidal had not just read the book, he had engaged with it deeply, questioning, connecting, reflecting on the text. Eduardo was still examining the book when the office door opened. He turned, expecting Vidal, but instead found Lucia, her expression tense. "Mr. Morales," she said, her usual warmth subdued. "I'm sorry about the change of plans." Eduardo returned the book to its place. "Is something wrong?" Lucia closed the door behind her. "There's a situation, a hostile takeover attempt by Inva Group. They've called an emergency board meeting to discuss their offer." She hesitated. "It's not going well. Several board members support the sale." "And Vidal doesn't?" "No. Inva Group has a reputation for acquisitions that maximize short-term profits through mass layoffs and asset stripping. Everything Mr. Vidal has built would be dismantled." Eduardo understood now the tension in the building. "Why are you telling me this?" Lucia moved closer, her voice dropping. "Because Mr. Vidal respects you. In the past week, he's mentioned your conversations several times. He values your perspective. I'm just an artist he hired for a portrait." "You're more than that," Lucia insisted. "You've connected with him in a way few people do. He sees something in you, a clarity perhaps, an authenticity." Eduardo shook his head, uncomfortable with the weight of her implication. "What do you expect me to do?" "Just listen to him. When he comes, he'll need someone who understands what's at stake, not just for him but for everyone who works here." Before Eduardo could respond, the door opened again, and Vidal entered. The change in him was immediately apparent, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained frustration. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Eduardo," he said, his voice tight, "I apologize for keeping you waiting." Lucia quietly excused herself, leaving the two men alone. "We can reschedule," Eduardo offered. "You clearly have more important matters to attend to." Vidal shook his head. "No, this," he gestured between them, "is a welcome respite from that room full of vultures downstairs." He moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a bottle and 2 glasses. "Do you drink whiskey?" Eduardo nodded. "I used to enjoy a good single malt." Vidal poured 2 fingers in each glass, handed one to Eduardo, then sank into a chair with a heavy sigh. "They want to sell the company." "So I heard." Vidal raised an eyebrow. "Lucia? She's concerned." "She should be. We all should be." Vidal took a swallow of whiskey. "Inva Group has made what they're calling a generous offer, 30% premium over current share price. To most of the board it looks like a windfall, but you see it differently. I see what happens after the sale. I've watched Inva Group's pattern with other acquisitions. They promise to maintain operations, to preserve jobs. Then, once the deal closes, they strip everything valuable, lay off most of the workforce, and sell the remaining assets piecemeal." Eduardo sipped his whiskey, savoring the smoky complexity. It had been years since he'd tasted anything so fine. "What options do you have?" "Limited ones. I still own 30% of the company, but I need a majority to block the sale. 4 board members are with me. 3 are firmly in favor of selling. 2 are undecided." Vidal ran a hand through his hair. "We've recessed for an hour while everyone reviews the financials again. And you think that will change minds?" "No. Numbers aren't what's at stake here. It's vision versus expedience, long-term sustainability versus short-term profit." Vidal leaned forward. "Do you know what I built this company to be, Eduardo? Not just successful, but meaningful. A place that creates value for everyone it touches, employees, customers, communities." "An admirable goal," Eduardo said, but rare in practice. Because it's hard. Because the market rewards quick profits over lasting value. Because shareholders want returns now, not promises about tomorrow. Vidal's frustration was palpable. I've spent 15 years building something that matters, and they're ready to dismantle it in an afternoon for a stock premium. Eduardo considered the man before him, not the polished CEO he'd first met, but someone fighting for something he believed in, something larger than himself. What do you need to convince them? He asked. Vidal gave a bitter laugh. A miracle, or barring that, a way to make them see beyond the bottom line. To understand what's really at stake. Eduardo was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, show them. Show them what? The impact. Not in reports or projections, but in reality. The lives your company touches. The difference it makes. Vidal frowned. The meeting reconvenes in 40 minutes. Then you have 40 minutes to change the narrative. A spark of interest flickered in Vidal's eyes. What do you have in mind? For the next half hour they talked intensely, formulating a plan that was either brilliant or desperate, perhaps both. When Lucia returned to inform Vidal that the board was reassembling, he was energized, focused. I need 10 more minutes, he told her, and then I want you to bring the board to conference room A. All of them. Lucia glanced between the two men, noting the change in Vidal's demeanor. What are you planning? A different kind of presentation, Vidal replied. He turned to Eduardo. Are you ready for this? Eduardo nodded, though uncertainty flickered within him. What they were attempting was unorthodox at best, potentially disastrous at worst, but there was something compelling about the challenge, about using his voice, so long silent, for something that mattered. I haven't given a lecture in 5 years, he said. I'm not sure I remember how. Vidal's smile was grim but determined. Just speak the truth as you see it, that's all I'm asking. 20 minutes later, Eduardo found himself facing the Grupo Vitalex board of directors. 9 men and women whose combined net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. They had entered the conference room with expressions ranging from curiosity to impatience to outright annoyance, clearly wondering why their crucial deliberations had been interrupted. Vidal stood at the head of the table, his authority reasserted, his voice steady. Before we continue our discussion about Inva Group's offer, I want to introduce you to someone. This is Eduardo Morales, former professor of philosophy at Universidad Nacional, currently working as an independent artist. The board members' expressions shifted to confusion. One man, silver-haired and impatient, checked his watch pointedly. Mr. Vidal, he began. With all due respect, please, Vidal interrupted. 10 minutes, that's all I'm asking. The man subsided, though his displeasure remained evident. Vidal nodded to Eduardo, then took a seat. Eduardo wheeled himself to the head of the table, acutely aware of the contrast between his weathered appearance and the immaculate suits surrounding him. For a moment, doubt threatened to overwhelm him. What did he, a homeless man in a broken wheelchair, have to say to these powerful individuals? But then he remembered what Vidal had told him. Speak the truth as you see it. Ladies and gentlemen, Eduardo began, his voice rusty but gaining strength, I won't pretend to understand the financial intricacies of corporate acquisitions. My expertise lies elsewhere, in the study of human existence, of meaning, of value. He paused, making eye contact with each person at the table. 5 years ago I was a professor with tenure, a home in Colinas del Norte, and a future that seemed secure. Then came the accident that took my wife and my career. Within 18 months I had lost everything, my health, my home, my purpose. The room was silent now, attention fixed on Eduardo. What I discovered on the streets was not just physical hardship, but invisibility. Each day hundreds of people walked past me without seeing me. I became not a person, but an inconvenience, a reminder of fragility that most prefer to ignore. Eduardo wheeled closer to the table, his gaze direct and challenging. But here's what I've observed from that invisible place. The true measure of a society, or a company, isn't found in its profits or its stock price. It's found in how it treats those with the least power, the least voice. He gestured toward the windows, toward the city beyond. From my spot beneath a jacaranda tree, I've watched this company for years. I've seen employees leave this building at the end of the day, not defeated, as so many corporate workers are, but purposeful, I've watched your community programs in action, the technology training centers in low-income neighborhoods, the entrepreneurship incubators, the scholarship funds. Eduardo turned to face Vidal. What, Mr. Vidal has built here isn't just a profitable business. It's an ecosystem of value that extends far beyond your balance sheet. It creates ripples of opportunity that reach places your quarterly reports never measure. The silver-haired man shifted uncomfortably. This is all very touching, but sentiment doesn't change market realities. Doesn't it? Eduardo countered. What is the market but a collective expression of what we value? And if we value only immediate returns, if we sacrifice long-term sustainability for short-term gains, what does that say about us? About our vision for the future? He wheeled back, addressing the entire board now. I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I'm here to remind you that your decision affects more than stock prices. It affects lives, thousands of them. Not just employees, but their families, their communities, all the invisible connections that make up the fabric of this city. Eduardo's voice softened, but his words remained intense. When I lost everything, I discovered something essential. Dignity isn't found in possessions or positions. It's found in mattering, in knowing that your existence has meaning beyond yourself. What Mr. Vidal has created here allows that dignity to flourish. Eduardo paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The boardroom remained silent, expressions ranging from thoughtful to skeptical to moved. You sit in this room, he continued quietly, surrounded by comfort and security, making decisions that will never directly impact your lives. But for thousands of others, what you decide today will determine whether they can pay their rent, send their children to school, or plan for a future with any confidence. He turned his wheelchair, making a slow circle to face each board member in turn. I'm not asking for charity or sentimentality. I'm asking for vision, the courage to look beyond the next quarter, beyond the immediate gain, to the kind of company, the kind of world you want to build. The silver-haired man cleared his throat. Mr. Morales, while your perspective is unique, business decisions must ultimately be based on financial realities. Inver Group's offer represents significant value for our shareholders. Value, Eduardo repeated, the word hanging between them. What exactly do you mean by that word? Money alone or something larger? Before the man could respond, another board member spoke up, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of authority. I've worked with Inver Group before, she said, addressing her colleagues rather than Eduardo. Their pattern is consistent. They promise continuity, but deliver decimation. Within 6 months, this company as we know it will cease to exist. The room shifted, attention now focused on her. Maria, the silver-haired man said, you can't know that for certain. Can't I? She countered. Look at Telecom Andina. Look at Grupo Industrial. Look at the pattern and tell me honestly that you expect a different outcome here. A younger board member leaned forward. But the premium they're offering, 30% over current value. We have a fiduciary responsibility to consider it. We also have a responsibility to the long-term health of this company, Maria responded, and to the promises we've made to our employees and communities. The debate continued, Eduardo forgotten momentarily as the board members engaged with each other. Vidal remained silent, watching the dynamics unfold, his expression unreadable. Finally, as the discussion reached a natural pause, Eduardo spoke again. May I offer one final thought? Attention returned to him, some faces now more receptive, others still guarded. In philosophy, we often discuss the concept of the good life, what it means to live well, to create meaning. It's not measured in possessions or power, but in contribution, in what you leave behind that makes the world better than you found it. Eduardo looked directly at the silver-haired man. When you look back on this decision years from now, which outcome will allow you to say you contributed to something meaningful? Which will let you tell your grandchildren that you helped build something lasting, rather than profiting from its destruction? The question hung in the air, unanswered, but unavoidable. Vidal finally stood. Thank you, Eduardo. He turned to the board. Shall we return to our deliberations? As Eduardo was escorted from the room by Lucia, the board members began filing out behind them, their expressions thoughtful. The silver-haired man paused beside Eduardo, studying him with new interest. An unusual perspective, he said, but perhaps a necessary one. In the hallway, Lucia's eyes were bright with excitement. "That was incredible," she whispered. "You said exactly what needed to be said." Eduardo shook his head, suddenly exhausted. "I spoke from experience, nothing more. Sometimes that's the most powerful kind of truth." She touched his shoulder lightly. "Thank you." Vidal approached them, his expression serious, but no longer despairing. "The board is taking a private lunch to continue discussions. We'll reconvene at 2. He extended his hand to Eduardo. "Whatever happens, I'm grateful." Eduardo nodded, unsure what else to say. This brief foray into corporate politics felt surreal, a strange detour from his solitary existence. The portrait, he remembered suddenly. "I should finish it." "Later," Vidal said. "For now, please join me for lunch. There's a private dining room on the 65th floor." The meal was simple but elegant. Grilled fish, fresh vegetables, crusty bread. As they ate, Vidal spoke of his vision for the company, of projects still in development, of communities yet to be served. There was a quiet intensity to him now, a resolved quality that hadn't been present before. "Even if we lose this vote," he said, "I want you to know that what you did today mattered. You reminded us all of something essential that gets lost in spreadsheets and stock prices." Eduardo found himself moved by Vidal's sincerity. "I just spoke what I believe." "That's rare enough in corporate boardrooms," Vidal replied with a small smile. After lunch, Eduardo was escorted to a small office where he could rest before his return journey. The events of the morning had drained him, and he dozed in his wheelchair, the sunlight warming his face through the windows. He was awakened by a light knock. The door opened to reveal Lucia, her expression radiant. 7-2, she said without preamble. They voted to reject the offer. Eduardo blinked, processing the information. "Vidal convinced them?" "You did," Lucia corrected. "After you left, 3 of the undecided members switched to our side. Even Hernandez, the silver-haired man, ultimately voted against the sale." Eduardo shook his head, surprised by the outcome and his role in it. "I'm glad. Mr. Vidal would like to see you before you leave. He's in his office." When Eduardo entered Vidal's office, he found the CEO standing at the windows, gazing out at the city. He turned at the sound of the door, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "We won," he said simply. "So I heard. Congratulations." Vidal crossed to his desk, picking up an envelope. "This is for you. Payment for the portrait." Eduardo accepted it with a nod. "I should complete it." "Keep what you have," Vidal said. "It's perfect as it is. Unfinished, like all of us." He paused. "But I'd like to discuss something else with you. A proposal." Eduardo raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I'd like you to consider a position here at Grupo Vitalex." The suggestion was so unexpected that Eduardo nearly laughed. "Doing what exactly?" "I'm hardly corporate material." "That's precisely why I want you here," Vidal replied. "What you said to the board today, about dignity, about meaning, about seeing beyond numbers, that perspective is invaluable. I'd like you to help us develop a more comprehensive approach to our community engagement." Eduardo frowned. "Isn't that Lucia's department?" "She suggested this," Vidal admitted. "She believes you could help us see blind spots, identify needs we're missing, develop programs that address deeper issues." The offer was tempting, a chance to re-enter the world, to use his mind again, to have purpose. But doubt crept in, cold and familiar. "This feels like charity," Eduardo said quietly. Vidal's expression hardened slightly. "I don't do charity, Eduardo. I make investments. What I saw today was a mind that cuts through pretense, that speaks truth regardless of consequence. That's an asset I'm willing to pay for." Eduardo was silent, the offer hanging between them. "Think about it," Vidal continued more gently. "Take a few days. The position would include accommodations in the company apartments next door, health benefits, and a salary commensurate with your expertise." "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," Vidal replied simply. "The choice is yours." As Eduardo left the Torreon that afternoon, his mind churned with possibilities. The envelope in his satchel contained more money than he'd seen in years, enough to secure modest housing, to begin rebuilding some semblance of stability. But Vidal's offer promised more than financial security. It offered re-entry into a world Eduardo had believed closed to him forever. That night, beneath his jacaranda tree, Eduardo couldn't sleep. The city sounds, once so familiar they faded into background, seemed suddenly intrusive, the ground harder than usual, the air colder. He had grown accustomed to his existence on the margins, had found a kind of peace in his reduction to essentials. The prospect of change, even positive change, was disorienting. "What would you do, Elena?" he whispered to the stars visible between the branches above. His wife had been the practical one, the planner, the voice of reason. In the silence that followed, he imagined her response. Pragmatic, direct, tinged with the gentle humor that had been her hallmark. "You always overthink things, Eduardo. Take the job. Get a shower. The rest will sort itself out." The memory brought a smile to his lips. 5 years, and still he could hear her voice so clearly. By morning, his decision was made. He would accept Vidal's offer, not out of desperation or gratitude, but because it offered the chance to contribute something meaningful again, to matter in ways beyond mere existence. He arrived at the Torreon as the morning crowd was streaming through the revolving doors, briefcases in hand, coffee cups clutched like talismans against the day ahead. At reception, he asked for Lucia, prepared to wait in the busy lobby. To his surprise, the receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled in recognition. "Mr. Morales," she said, "Ms. Mendez is expecting you. Please go right up." The ease of his admission, the absence of suspicion that had marked his earlier visits, was striking. Something had changed in how he was perceived. No longer an intruder, but an expected guest. Lucia greeted him warmly, ushering him into her office, a bright space filled with plants and colorful artwork from local artists. "I've been hoping you'd come," she said. "Have you thought about Mr. Vidal's offer?" Eduardo nodded. "I've decided to accept, with one condition. Which is, I want to start small, a consultancy role rather than a full position. 3 months, after which both sides can reassess." Lucia considered this, then nodded. "I think that's reasonable. It gives you time to adjust, and us time to develop the role properly." She made a note on her tablet. "Any other concerns?" Eduardo hesitated. "The accommodations, I'd prefer something simple. I've grown unused to luxury." "Of course, there are several options in the company building. Some are quite basic. Studio apartments used for visiting consultants or interns." As they discussed details, Eduardo felt a strange blend of excitement and apprehension. After years of day-to-day survival, the prospect of a future stretching beyond the immediate was almost overwhelming. When Vidal joined them later, he accepted Eduardo's counterproposal without hesitation. 3 months it is, he agreed. "Though I suspect once you're here, you'll find reasons to stay longer." By the end of the week, Eduardo had moved into a small but comfortable studio apartment on the 15th floor of the residential Torreon, the companion building to the corporate headquarters. The space was simple: a bed, a small kitchenette, a desk by the window, and an accessible bathroom. After years on the street, it felt simultaneously liberating and claustrophobic. The first night, he couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the silence too complete, the walls too close. He ended up in his wheelchair by the window, watching the city lights until dawn painted the sky with pale fingers of gold. The second night was better. The third, better still. By the end of the week, he had established new routines. Morning coffee at the small cafe in the lobby, days spent in meetings or researching community needs, evenings reading books borrowed from Vidal's extensive library. His role began to take shape organically. Initially brought in to consult on community engagement, Eduardo soon found himself involved in a broader range of discussions. His outsider perspective, combined with his academic background and street-level insights, offered unique value in conversations about corporate responsibility, ethical decision-making, and community impact. In his third week, he was invited to participate in a planning session for a new technology training center in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. "The model we've used before focuses on coding and digital literacy," Lucia explained, displaying diagrams on the conference room screen. "It's been successful in other areas." Eduardo studied the plans, considering, "What about practical applications?" "What do you mean?" "Most people in that neighborhood are working multiple jobs just to survive. They don't have time for abstract skills. They need technology that solves immediate problems, accessing healthcare information, finding employment, connecting with resources." The discussion shifted, the team rethinking their approach based on Eduardo's insights. By the end of the session, the plan had evolved from a traditional training center to a multifunctional hub that would combine technology access with practical support services. As Eduardo rolled out of the meeting, Vidal fell into step beside him. "That was exactly the kind of contribution I hoped for," he said. "You changed the entire framework of the project." Eduardo shrugged. "I just pointed out what seemed obvious from where I sit." "That's the value," Vidal insisted. "Your perspective changes what's visible to the rest of us." As the weeks passed, Eduardo's role expanded further. He began conducting workshops for employees, sharing insights about dignity, purpose, and community that challenged conventional corporate thinking. Initially met with skepticism, his sessions gradually gained popularity, particularly among younger staff members, eager for meaning beyond career advancement. One afternoon, as Eduardo was returning to his apartment, he encountered a woman in the elevator who looked vaguely familiar. "Professor Morales?" she asked hesitantly. Eduardo studied her, trying to place the face. "I'm sorry, have we met?" "I was in your existentialism seminar at Universidad Nacional 8 years ago," she smiled. "Maria Suarez. I sat in the back and asked too many questions about Camus." Recognition dawned. "Maria, of course, you wrote that excellent paper comparing The Stranger with Gabriel Garcia Marquez." Her face lit up. "You remember. It was an insightful analysis, hard to forget." "I never thought I'd see you again," she admitted, "especially not here. I'm in the legal department, just started 3 months ago." As the elevator reached her floor, Maria hesitated. Would you have time for coffee sometime?" "I'd love to hear what you're doing now." Eduardo nodded. "I'd like that." The encounter left him thoughtful. For years he had existed in isolation, convinced that his former life was irretrievably lost. Now unexpected connections were emerging, threads from his past weaving into this new present. That evening, as he sketched the city skyline from his window, Eduardo reflected on the changes of the past month. The stability of housing, the purpose of meaningful work, the beginning of new relationships, all things he had believed beyond his reach. There was a fragility to it still, a sense that it might dissolve like morning mist, but beneath that uncertainty lay something he had almost forgotten: hope. The following week brought a new challenge. Vidal invited Eduardo to join a select team developing a comprehensive corporate responsibility initiative that would become central to the company's identity. "We're calling it Visible Value," Vidal explained during their initial meeting. "The idea is to make visible the connections between corporate decisions and community impact, to create metrics that measure not just profit, but human flourishing." The team included Lucia, 2 senior executives, and a data analyst named Carlos, who specialized in social impact measurement. Their task was ambitious: to create a framework that would fundamentally change how the company evaluated success. During one intensive session, as they grappled with how to quantify intangible benefits, Eduardo grew frustrated with the limitations of traditional approaches. "Numbers won't capture what matters most," he argued. "You can count jobs created or dollars invested. But how do you measure dignity restored, purpose discovered, community strengthened?" Carlos, the data analyst, looked up from his laptop. "Maybe we need both, the quantitative and the qualitative. Numbers to satisfy shareholders, stories to convey meaning." "Stories," Eduardo repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, the human element that numbers can't capture." From that insight emerged a dual approach: rigorous data collection combined with narrative documentation. The team began developing a system that would track not just economic impacts, but personal transformations, creating a rich tapestry of evidence that spoke to both heads and hearts. As their work progressed, Eduardo found himself increasingly invested in the outcome. What had begun as a temporary role was becoming a calling, a chance to translate his philosophical ideals into practical impact. One evening, after a particularly productive session, Lucia joined Eduardo as he waited for the elevator. "You've changed things here," she said quietly, "in ways that go beyond projects or initiatives." Eduardo raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "People talk differently now, ask different questions, consider impacts they would have ignored before." She smiled. "You've made the invisible visible." The phrase stayed with Eduardo, echoing in his mind as he returned to his apartment. Had he really made such a difference, or was he simply a novelty, a temporary disruption to business as usual? As his 3-month trial period neared its end, Eduardo found himself at a crossroads. Vidal had made it clear that a permanent position awaited him if he wanted it. The work was meaningful, the impact tangible, the compensation more than adequate. Yet something held him back, a nagging sense of incompleteness, of a journey half finished. One Saturday morning, Eduardo wheeled himself to his old spot beneath the jacaranda tree. The street vendors recognized him, greeting him with a mixture of surprise and warmth. He spent hours there, sketching familiar faces, listening to neighborhood gossip, absorbing the rhythm of a world he had only recently left behind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plaza, Eduardo made his decision. He would stay at Grupo Vitalex, but with a modified role, one that would allow him to bridge worlds, to maintain connections with both the corporate tower and the street corner. When he presented his proposal to Vidal and Lucia the following Monday, they listened with interest. "I want to create a community liaison program," Eduardo explained, "one that recruits people from marginalized communities, not as tokens or charity cases, but as valuable sources of insight and connection." Vidal nodded slowly. "A network of voices usually unheard in corporate settings." "Exactly. People who can help us see what we would otherwise miss." Eduardo leaned forward, animated by the vision. "And I want to start with artists, street artists, informal creators who capture the soul of neighborhoods in ways formal studies never could." "Like you did," Lucia observed. Eduardo nodded. "Art reveals what statistics obscure." Over the next 6 months, the Community Voices initiative took shape. Eduardo identified talented individuals from across the city, muralists from the southern barrios, storytellers from the western hills, musicians from the coastal settlements. Each brought unique perspectives, challenging assumptions and expanding possibilities. The program wasn't without challenges. Some corporate executives questioned its value, seeing it as a distraction from core business. Some community members were suspicious, viewing it as exploitation or tokenism. Eduardo navigated these tensions carefully, building trust through transparency and consistent follow-through. A turning point came when one of the street artists Eduardo had recruited, a young woman named Sophia, who created intricate paper cuttings, developed a visual system for explaining complex financial concepts to communities with low literacy rates. Her work transformed a struggling microfinance program into a successful community resource, demonstrating the practical value of artistic thinking in business contexts. The success captured attention beyond Grupo Vitalex. Other companies began exploring similar initiatives, and Eduardo found himself invited to speak at business forums and community organizations about bridging corporate and community worlds. As his public profile grew, so did interest in his personal story. A local journalist requested an interview, framing it as an inspirational tale of overcoming adversity. Eduardo declined politely, but firmly. "I'm not interested in becoming a symbol," he told Lucia after the third such request. "I'm here to do work that matters, not to be held up as some kind of miracle." Lucia understood his reluctance, but gently pushed back. "Your journey matters, Eduardo. It gives context to your insights, authenticity to your voice." "My insights should stand on their own," he insisted. The tension remained unresolved, Eduardo maintaining his privacy even as his influence expanded. But life, as he well knew, had its own rhythms and revelations. One afternoon, during a community workshop in the Eastern District, Eduardo encountered a familiar face, a middle-aged woman who studied him with increasing certainty as the session progressed. When the formal activities concluded, she approached his wheelchair. "Professor Morales," she asked hesitantly, "it is you, isn't it?" Eduardo nodded, recognizing her as a former colleague from the university. "Carmen." "It's been a long time." "Years," she agreed. "We all wondered what happened to you after—" She trailed off, uncomfortable. "After I disappeared," Eduardo finished for her. "It's all right, Carmen. Life took an unexpected turn." Over coffee, he shared a condensed version of his journey. The accident, the losses, the years on the street, and finally, his unlikely connection with Grupo Vitalex. Carmen listened with growing amazement. You should tell this story, Eduardo, she said when he finished. Students at the university would benefit from hearing it, especially those studying ethics or social development. Eduardo shook his head. I'm not interested in becoming a cautionary tale or an inspiration. Not that, Carmen insisted. A witness. Someone who has seen both worlds and can speak truth to both. The suggestion lingered with Eduardo, challenging his resistance to public storytelling. Perhaps there was value in his particular journey, not as a personal narrative, but as a bridge between experiences rarely connected. That evening he spoke with Vidal about the encounter and Carmen's suggestion. She may be right, Vidal said thoughtfully. Your story has power, not as inspiration porn or corporate propaganda, but as authentic testimony about dignity, purpose, and the systems that either support or undermine them. Eduardo considered this perspective. I've spent so long being defined by circumstance. Professor, victim, homeless man, consultant. The thought of deliberately shaping that narrative is uncomfortable. All the more reason to do it, Vidal suggested. To reclaim authorship. The conversation planted a seed that grew slowly over the following weeks. Eduardo began writing, not a memoir or a manifesto, but a series of reflections on visibility and invisibility, on the architecture of dignity, on the spaces between established systems where so many lives unfolded. The writing process was both painful and liberating, forcing Eduardo to revisit moments of despair, but also to recognize threads of resilience he hadn't fully acknowledged. What emerged wasn't a neat arc of fall and redemption, but a more complex exploration of how meaning persists even when conventional markers of success are stripped away. When he finally shared the manuscript with Lucia, her response was immediate and emotional. This needs to be heard, she said simply. Not just read, but heard, in your voice with your presence. Eduardo was skeptical. I'm hardly a public speaker these days. You were a professor, Lucia reminded him. You know how to hold a room. That was another life, was it? Or just another chapter of the same life? The question struck Eduardo deeply, challenging his tendency to segment his existence into discrete befores and afters. Perhaps there was more continuity than he had allowed himself to recognize. With reluctance that gradually gave way to cautious engagement, Eduardo agreed to an internal presentation, a talk for Grupo Vitalex employees based on his writings. Lucia arranged for the event to be held in the company's largest conference space, expecting perhaps 50 attendees. Over 200 people registered. On the evening of the presentation, Eduardo wheeled himself onto the small stage, acutely aware of the contrast between his weathered appearance and the corporate setting. The audience was diverse. Executives in business attire, technical staff in casual wear, maintenance workers still in uniform. I'm not here to inspire you, Eduardo began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I'm not here to make you feel fortunate by comparison, or to assure you that everything happens for a reason. I'm here to speak about what becomes visible when you lose the protective layers of status and security, when you see the world from the ground up. For the next hour, Eduardo shared his journey, not as a neat narrative of fall and redemption, but as a complex exploration of dignity, visibility, and what it means to matter in a society that measures worth by productivity and possession. He spoke of the university that had celebrated his intellect until his body became inconvenient, of the friends who had drifted away, uncomfortable with tragedy they couldn't fix, of the thousands who had walked past him on the street, gazes averted to avoid the discomfort of his existence. But he also spoke of unexpected kindnesses, the flower vendor who saved him a blossom each morning, the librarian who let him use the bathroom after hours, the street children who brought him scraps of cardboard for his art. What I learned beneath that jacaranda tree, Eduardo said, was that dignity isn't bestowed by status or achievement. It exists inherently in being human. What our systems can do, what our companies, our institutions, our communities can do, is either honor that dignity or diminish it. As he spoke, Eduardo noticed a shift in the room, a leaning in, a collective engagement that transcended polite attention. These weren't abstract concepts for many present. They were lived realities, personal struggles with worth and meaning in a system that often reduced humans to functions. The greatest poverty I experienced wasn't material, Eduardo continued. It was invisibility, the gradual erasure of my humanity in the eyes of others. And the greatest wealth wasn't found in regaining comfort, but in regaining purpose, in mattering again, not just to myself but to a community. When Eduardo finished speaking, the silence was complete. Then, slowly, someone began to applaud. Others joined, the sound building until it filled the room. Not the polite acknowledgement of a corporate presentation, but something more visceral, more genuine. As people approached afterward, Eduardo was struck by the nature of their responses. They didn't offer pity or abstract praise, but specific connections to their own experiences. The executive who had watched her father struggle after losing his job, the maintenance worker balancing 3 children and 2 jobs, the young programmer questioning the meaning of his work beyond technical challenge. Something had opened in that room, a space for authentic conversation about what mattered beyond profit and position. In the days that followed, the impact rippled outward. Employees began approaching Lucia and Vidal with ideas for expanding the Community Voices initiative, for incorporating dignity-centered metrics into departmental goals, for creating more inclusive decision-making processes. Vidal, observing these developments with satisfaction, invited Eduardo to his office. "You've started something significant," he said. "Something that could transform not just this company, but perhaps our entire approach to business." Eduardo shook his head. "I just shared my experience." "Exactly," Vidal agreed. "And in doing so, you made visible what most corporate structures deliberately obscure: the human impact of economic decisions, the moral questions beneath the metrics." He leaned forward, eyes bright with purpose. "I want to expand this conversation beyond Grupo Vitalex, to create a forum where business leaders and community voices can engage directly, where new models of corporate responsibility can emerge." The idea evolved rapidly, from internal initiative to public platform, from isolated experiment to systemic challenge. Within months, plans were underway for the first Visible Value Summit, bringing together corporate executives, community leaders, academics and individuals with lived experience of economic marginalization. As the summit approached, Eduardo found himself at the center of a movement he had never intended to create. His story had become a catalyst, his perspective a bridge between worlds often separated by wealth, power, and perception. The night before the summit, unable to sleep, Eduardo wheeled himself to the window of his apartment, gazing out at the city that had been both his prison and his salvation. Below, the jacaranda tree that had sheltered him was in full bloom, its purple flowers visible even in the darkness, a reminder of where his journey had begun. Tomorrow he would speak to business leaders from across the country, sharing insights hard-won through loss and survival. He would challenge assumptions, disrupt complacencies, invite new possibilities. And in doing so, he would complete a circle begun that rainy afternoon when a billionaire had seen beyond appearance to essence, when a simple sketch had opened an unexpected door. Eduardo smiled slightly, the expression visible in his reflection against the night-darkened glass. Life moved in strange circles, connecting points that seemed impossibly distant, revealing patterns only visible from a distance. From invisible to visible, from marginalized to centered, from survival to purpose. Not a straight line of progress, but a complex journey of loss and discovery, of endings and beginnings interwoven. Outside his window, the city continued its nocturnal rhythm, lights blinking, traffic flowing, lives unfolding in countless configurations of struggle and joy. Somewhere beneath a different tree, another soul sought shelter, another story waited to be recognized. There was still so much invisibility to address, so many voices yet unheard, so much dignity yet to be honored. Tomorrow would be one more step on that longer journey, not an arrival but a continuing. Eduardo turned from the window, ready at last for sleep, for dreams, for whatever dawn would bring. The Visible Value Summit exceeded all expectations. Held in the grand ballroom of the city's oldest hotel, a space where marble columns met modern lighting, where history and innovation coexisted, it brought together an unprecedented mix of corporate leaders, community organizers, academics, and individuals whose life experiences spanned the full spectrum of economic reality. Eduardo's opening address set the tone, challenging but not confrontational, visionary but grounded in lived experience. He spoke not as a victim or an inspiration, but as a bridge between worlds, offering insights visible only from the margins. The question before us, he concluded, is not whether business can be profitable and ethical. It's whether we have the courage to reimagine success itself, to create metrics that measure human flourishing alongside financial returns, to build companies that generate not just wealth, but meaning. What followed was 2 days of intense dialogue, practical workshops, and unexpected connections. Corporate executives sat beside community advocates, listening more than speaking. People who had experienced homelessness or extreme poverty shared expertise that no business school could teach. Traditional hierarchies temporarily dissolved in the shared pursuit of new possibilities. On the final afternoon, as participants gathered for closing reflections, Vidal took the stage. He had been notably restrained throughout the summit, allowing others to lead while offering quiet support. Now he addressed the room with unusual emotion. 3 months ago, he began, our company faced a hostile takeover attempt. The financial case for selling was compelling, a 30% premium that would have enriched shareholders significantly. By conventional metrics, rejecting that offer was irrational. He paused, scanning the room. But what price do we place on community, on dignity, on the difference between extracting value and creating it? Vidal gestured toward Eduardo, seated at the side of the stage. It took someone who had lost everything to help us see what we stood to lose. Not just jobs or market share, but purpose, meaning, connection to the communities we serve. Vidal announced the establishment of the Visible Value Institute, an independent research and advocacy center dedicated to developing new models of corporate community engagement. Eduardo would serve as its founding director, with initial funding from Grupo Vitalix, but governance shared between business and community representatives. As applause filled the room, Eduardo sat motionless, overwhelmed by the distance traveled from that rainy afternoon beneath the jacaranda tree. This wasn't a path he had chosen or even imagined possible, yet somehow it felt right, a purpose that drew on all he had been and all he had become. The months following the summit were intense. Establishing the institute required navigating complex practical and philosophical questions. What began as a conceptual framework needed to become operational reality, with staff, facilities, programs, and measurable impact. Eduardo insisted on situating the institute not in the business district, but in a transitional neighborhood where corporate and community worlds intersected. The building they selected was a renovated textile factory, its industrial bones preserved, while interior spaces were transformed into flexible work areas, meeting rooms, and community gathering spaces. The staff grew organically, drawn from diverse backgrounds and experiences. Lucia joined as operations director, bringing her organizational skills and corporate connections. Maria Suarez, Eduardo's former student, now turned lawyer, came aboard to develop policy initiatives. And perhaps most significantly, Eduardo recruited Sophia, the paper-cutting artist from the Community Voices program, to lead creative communications. Numbers convince the head, Eduardo explained when questioned about this unorthodox choice. Stories and images transform the heart. We need both. Under this unlikely leadership team, the Institute began to gain recognition. Their first major research project, a comprehensive analysis of corporate impact on community dignity, was published in the Journal of Business Ethics, generating academic interest. Their community engagement toolkit was adopted by 3 multinational corporations, creating practical impact. And their weekly open forums brought together voices rarely heard in the same room, fostering unlikely collaborations. For Eduardo, the work was deeply fulfilling, but also exhausting. His disability, long managed through sheer determination, began asserting itself more forcefully. Pain that had been a constant but background presence became sometimes debilitating. Medical consultations confirmed what he had long suspected. His condition was degenerative, with few treatment options. He shared this reality with no one, determined that his physical limitations would not define the Institute's work. But Lucia, observant and perceptive, noticed the changes. The longer recovery periods, the carefully masked pain, the strategic conservation of energy. "You need to build a team that can carry this forward," she said one evening, after a particularly demanding day had left Eduardo visibly drained. "Not because you're failing, but because this work is too important to rest on any single person." Eduardo knew she was right. The vision had grown beyond what any individual could sustain, becoming a movement with momentum beyond his direct control. The question was how to ensure its continuation without losing its essential character, the authentic connection to lived experience that differentiated it from typical corporate initiatives. The answer emerged unexpectedly during a community listening session in one of the city's most marginalized neighborhoods. Eduardo had organized the event to gather input on economic development proposals that would affect the area. The turnout was impressive, residents of all ages filling the community center, many skeptical but willing to engage. Among them was a young man named Rafael, perhaps 25, seated in a wheelchair, much like Eduardo's own. Throughout the session, Rafael asked incisive questions, challenging assumptions and advocating eloquently for his community's needs. His perspective combined practical knowledge of neighborhood realities with sophisticated understanding of economic principles, an unusual and powerful combination. Afterward, Eduardo approached him. "Your contributions today were exceptional. How did you develop such a comprehensive understanding of these issues?" Rafael shrugged. "Economics student, or I was until the accident. 2 years ago." He gestured to his wheelchair. "University wasn't exactly accommodating. And now? I tutor neighborhood kids, run a small advocacy group for disabled residents, try to stay useful." Rafael studied Eduardo with sudden recognition. "You're the professor who became homeless. The one who works, you're the professor who became homeless. The one who works with the big corporation now." Rafael's tone held curiosity rather than judgment. Eduardo nodded. "That's part of my story, yes. They say you didn't sell out," Rafael continued, "that you're actually changing how they do business." "We're trying," Eduardo acknowledged. "It's complicated work." They talked for nearly an hour, Eduardo increasingly impressed by Rafael's combination of intellectual rigor and practical wisdom. Here was someone who, like himself, had experienced dramatic reversal of fortune, yet maintained both critical perspective and constructive engagement. As they parted, Eduardo handed Rafael his card. "The Institute could use someone with your insights. If you're interested, call me." Within weeks, Rafael had joined the team as a research associate, the first of several recruits with lived experience of economic marginalization. Eduardo began deliberately building a leadership pipeline, identifying individuals whose perspectives transcended traditional categories, whose thinking had been forged in the crucible of real struggle. 1 year after its founding, the Institute hosted a major conference on dignity economics that attracted participants from across the country and beyond. Eduardo, whose health had continued to decline, delivered the keynote from his wheelchair, his voice weaker but his message more powerful than ever. "Economics without ethics is not just incomplete, but dangerous," he told the assembled crowd. "It creates systems that measure everything except what matters most: the quality of human lives, the strength of communities, the sustainability of our shared future." The speech was reported in major business publications, expanding the Institute's influence and creating new opportunities for implementation of its principles. Companies began approaching them for consultation, universities requested curriculum input, policymakers sought their perspective on regulatory frameworks. Throughout this period of expansion, Eduardo maintained his connection to the streets where his journey had begun. Every week, regardless of weather or workload, he returned to his spot beneath the jacaranda tree, sketching portraits and engaging with the community that had been his home during his darkest years. "Why do you still go back?" Vidal asked him once. "You've moved beyond that life." Eduardo shook his head. "I haven't moved beyond it. I've incorporated it. The moment I forget what it feels like to be invisible is the moment my work loses its meaning." These weekly vigils kept Eduardo grounded as the Institute's profile rose. They also maintained his connection to a community that might otherwise have viewed his corporate association with suspicion. Street vendors, homeless individuals, neighborhood children, all knew him not as the director of a prestigious institute, but simply as Eduardo, the man who drew pictures and listened to stories. On one such afternoon, as Eduardo sketched a portrait of a newly arrived migrant family, a sleek car pulled up to the curb, the window lowered to reveal an elegantly dressed older man, silver-haired and distinguished. Eduardo recognized him immediately as Hernandez, the board member who had initially opposed Vidal, but ultimately voted against the Invergroup takeover. "Mr. Morales," Hernandez called, "I thought that was you. Do you have a moment?" Eduardo excused himself to the family and wheeled over to the car. "Mr. Hernandez, this is an unexpected pleasure." Hernandez gestured to the passenger seat. "Would you join me for a brief drive?" "There's something I'd like to discuss." Curious, Eduardo agreed. With practiced efficiency, he transferred from his wheelchair to the car, allowing the driver to stow his chair in the trunk. As they pulled away from the curb, Hernandez got straight to the point. "I've been following the work of your institute with great interest. What you've built in just a year is remarkable." "Thank you," Eduardo replied cautiously, wondering where this was leading. "It's also, I believe, at risk." Hernandez turned to face him directly. "Your dependence on Grupo Vitalex's funding creates both practical and perceptual vulnerabilities. One company change, one market downturn, and your entire operation could be compromised." Eduardo had been aware of this risk from the beginning. "We're developing other funding sources. These things take time." "Indeed," Hernandez nodded. "Which is why I'm here. I've spent 40 years in corporate governance, Mr. Morales. I've seen countless worthy initiatives rise and fall with changing leadership or economic conditions. The truly transformative work requires independence and sustainability." He handed Eduardo a folder. "My proposal: a 10-year funding commitment from a consortium of companies and foundations, structured to ensure both your operational stability and your intellectual autonomy." Eduardo opened the folder, scanning the documents with growing amazement. The funding package was substantial, enough to secure the Institute's future well beyond its initial phase. The list of participating organizations was equally impressive, representing diverse industries and perspectives. "Why?" Eduardo asked simply, looking up from the papers. Hernandez was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the city streets. "2 years ago, in that boardroom, you said something that has stayed with me. You asked what we would tell our grandchildren about our decisions, whether we could say we built something lasting or merely profited from destruction." He turned back to Eduardo. "I have 4 grandchildren, Mr. Morales. The oldest is 12. I find myself increasingly concerned with the world they will inherit, not just economically, but morally, socially, environmentally. Your institute represents a path forward that I believe is essential, not just desirable." The offer was compelling, addressing Eduardo's deepest concerns about the institute's long-term viability. Yet he hesitated, conscious of potential complications. "Have you discussed this with Vidal?" Hernandez nodded. "He's supportive, though naturally reluctant to see Grupo Vitalex's central role diminished. He understands, however, that true transformation requires broader ownership." By the time they returned to the jacaranda tree, the framework of an agreement had taken shape. The Institute would transition to consortium funding over 18 months, maintaining its core mission while expanding its reach and impact. Eduardo would continue as director during the transition, with succession planning a priority given his health concerns. When Eduardo shared the development with his leadership team the following day, reactions were mixed. Excitement about the expanded possibilities balanced against concerns about maintaining the Institute's distinctive character and community connections. "This is a validation of everything we've built," Lucia pointed out, "but it's also a test of our values. Can we grow without losing our soul?" Rafael, who had quickly become a central voice in the Institute, was more directly concerned about Eduardo. "This is about your health, isn't it? You're planning for what comes next." Eduardo didn't deny it. "The work needs to outlive any individual, including me." The transition process was complex, but ultimately successful. The consortium model provided stability while preserving the Institute's independence. New partners brought fresh perspectives and expanded reach, while the core team maintained fidelity to the founding vision. Within 2 years, the Visible Value Institute had established itself as a leading voice in the emerging field of dignity-centered economics. Throughout this period of growth and change, Eduardo's health continued its gradual decline. The pain became more persistent, his energy more limited, his dependence on assistance more pronounced. Yet his mind remained sharp, his vision clear, his commitment unwavering. As his physical capacity diminished, Eduardo focused increasingly on mentorship, preparing Rafael and others to carry the work forward, sharing the deeper philosophies that underpinned the Institute's more visible initiatives. These conversations, often extending late into the evening, became the heart of his contribution, a transmission of wisdom that transcended specific programs or projects. On the 5th anniversary of the Institute's founding, a major celebration was planned. Leaders from business, government, and community organizations gathered to commemorate what had been accomplished and to look toward future possibilities. The event was to feature a keynote address from Eduardo, followed by the unveiling of a new strategic framework for the next 5 years. That morning, Eduardo woke early, his body protesting more loudly than usual. The pain that had become his constant companion spiked sharply as he attempted to transfer to his wheelchair. After several attempts, he was forced to call for assistance. At the hospital, the diagnosis was swift and severe, a spinal compression that required immediate surgery. The procedure was successful, but left Eduardo weaker than before, facing weeks of recovery before he could return to even limited activity. From his hospital bed, Eduardo insisted that the anniversary celebration proceed as planned. Raphael would deliver the keynote, presenting the vision they had crafted together over months of deep discussion. Lucia would manage the logistics, ensuring that the essence of the Institute's work was properly conveyed. Sophia would unveil the art installation that visualized their impact, a collaborative piece created with community members from across the city. As Eduardo watched the live stream of the event from his hospital room, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what had been built, sadness at his physical absence, anxiety about the future, and beneath it all, a profound sense of completion. The vision he had articulated in that boardroom 5 years earlier had taken root, growing beyond his direct nurturing into something self-sustaining. The weeks of recovery stretched into months, Eduardo's return to full activity repeatedly delayed by complications. He worked from home when able, participating in meetings virtually, reviewing documents, providing guidance on key decisions. But increasingly, he observed the team functioning effectively without his direct involvement, making sound judgments, navigating complex challenges, maintaining authentic connections to the communities they served. On a warm spring afternoon, nearly 7 months after his surgery, Eduardo asked Vidal to join him for tea on the balcony of his apartment. They had maintained their friendship throughout the years, their initial professional connection evolving into genuine mutual respect and affection. "I need to step down," Eduardo said without preamble, once they were settled. "Permanently, not just during recovery." Vidal studied him, unsurprised but concerned. "Your health?" "Partly." Eduardo gestured toward the Institute's building, visible in the distance. "But also because it's time. The work has grown beyond me. It needs new energy, new vision. Have you chosen a successor?" Eduardo nodded. "Raphael. He has the intellect, the lived experience, and most importantly, the moral clarity. The board will need to approve, of course, but I believe they'll see what I see in him." Vidal was quiet for a moment, absorbing the significance of the decision. "What will you do?" "Write. Teach, perhaps, if I can find the right format. Continue my Thursday afternoons under the jacaranda." Eduardo smiled slightly. "Focus on what only I can do, and release the rest." The transition was announced the following week. Raphael accepted the directorship with a commitment to continuing the Institute's core mission while evolving its approaches to meet new challenges. Eduardo assumed the role of founder emeritus, a position that allowed him to contribute intellectually while stepping back from operational responsibilities. In his reduced professional capacity, Eduardo found unexpected freedom. His health stabilized, though at a diminished level that required careful management of energy and assistance with many physical tasks. Within these limitations, he discovered new forms of contribution. He began writing more systematically, developing the philosophical foundations of dignity economics into a book that would eventually be published by a major university press. He mentored young people from marginalized communities, helping them navigate educational and professional systems that often excluded their perspectives. And he continued his weekly presence beneath the jacaranda tree, sketching portraits and listening to stories from those passing through. One such Thursday, nearly 7 years after his first encounter with Vidal, Eduardo was finishing a sketch of a young woman with her infant when he noticed a familiar figure approaching. Vidal himself walking without his usual entourage, dressed more casually than his corporate persona typically allowed. "I thought I might find you here," Vidal said, stopping beside Eduardo's wheelchair. "My schedule is very predictable these days," Eduardo replied with a smile. "To what do I owe this visit?" Vidal hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've made a decision. I wanted you to be among the first to know." "You're stepping down," Eduardo guessed, reading the resolution in Vidal's expression. "Yes, after 22 years. Vidal sat on a nearby bench, suddenly looking his age in a way his corporate presence never revealed. "It's time for new leadership, new energy. I've named Lucia as my successor." Eduardo nodded approvingly. "An excellent choice. She'll continue what we've built while bringing her own vision." Vidal looked out across the plaza, toward the Torreon rising in the distance. "But that's not why I came to find you." He turned back to Eduardo, his expression serious. "I'm establishing a foundation, one focused on economic dignity and community resilience. I'd like your input on its formation." The symmetry wasn't lost on Eduardo, the wheel turning full circle. From that first commissioned portrait to this new collaboration. Different circumstances, different roles, but the same essential connection. Two men from vastly different worlds finding common purpose. "I'd be honored," he said simply. In the years that followed, their partnership deepened. The Vidal Foundation became a significant force for economic innovation, supporting community-led development across the country. The Institute, under Rafael's leadership, evolved into a global network of practitioners and researchers, advancing dignity-centered approaches to economic challenges. And Eduardo, despite his physical limitations, remained a vital voice in both, the philosopher-practitioner whose lived experience continued to ground theoretical frameworks in human reality. On the 10th anniversary of Eduardo's first entry into the Torreon, a special exhibition opened in the building's lobby, a collection of portraits spanning a decade of community engagement. At its center hung the unfinished portrait of Vidal that had started it all. Its incomplete state now a deliberate aesthetic choice rather than an accident of circumstance. The exhibition's opening drew hundreds of attendees, corporate executives and street vendors, academic researchers and neighborhood children, political leaders and homeless advocates. As Eduardo wheeled through the crowd, accepting congratulations and exchanging greetings, he was struck by the improbable community that had formed around a simple idea, that human dignity transcended economic status, that visibility was a prerequisite for justice, that meaningful connection across social boundaries was not just possible but essential. Late in the evening, as the crowd thinned, Eduardo found himself beside the central portrait, studying the younger Vidal captured in charcoal, the loneliness behind his eyes, the weight of responsibility in his posture, the humanity beneath the corporate persona. "You saw me," Vidal said quietly, joining him before the drawing. "When no one else did." Eduardo shook his head. "We saw each other." That was the beginning of everything that followed. Around them, the exhibition told the story of that everything, a decade of work that had changed not just a company, but an entire approach to business, that had created spaces where invisible people became visible, where economic systems bent toward human flourishing rather than mere efficiency. It wasn't a perfect story. There had been setbacks, resistances, compromises. The larger economic forces that created inequality and marginalization remained powerful. The work was, and would always be, incomplete. But something had shifted in this company, in this city, in the lives of thousands of individuals whose dignity had been recognized and honored. A different way of seeing had emerged, one that recognized the humanity in each person regardless of status or circumstance. As the exhibition closed and the building emptied, Eduardo wheeled himself outside, Vidal walking quietly beside him. Above them, stars appeared in the darkening sky, visible despite the city lights. Below, the streets hummed with evening activity, people heading home, to entertainment, to second jobs, to uncertain shelters. "Do you ever wonder," Vidal asked, "how differently things might have turned out if it hadn't rained that day? If you hadn't drawn my portrait?" Eduardo considered the question. "I believe significant connections find their way into being. If not that day, perhaps another. If not through art, then through some other medium." They stopped at the corner where Eduardo's journey had begun, beneath the jacaranda tree, now larger, its branches spreading more widely than before. The tree had witnessed everything: Eduardo's despair, his unexpected opportunity, the gradual transformation of possibility into reality. What matters, Eduardo continued, isn't the specific catalyst, but our readiness to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize each other's humanity despite the barriers of circumstance. Vidal nodded, understanding the deeper truth in Eduardo's words. For all their accomplishments, for all the systems changed and policies reformed, the most profound transformation had been personal, a shift in perception that allowed authentic connection across traditional boundaries. "I should get home," Eduardo said finally. "Tomorrow is a full day." "Can I offer you a ride?" Vidal asked. Eduardo shook his head, smiling. "Thank you, but no. I prefer to make my own way." As they parted, Eduardo watched Vidal walk toward the waiting car, no longer the untouchable billionaire, but simply a man, complex, fallible, striving in his own way toward meaning. So much had changed in the decades since their first encounter, yet the essential dynamic remained: two people seeing each other beyond labels and limitations, recognizing in each other something worthy of attention and respect. Eduardo turned his wheelchair toward home, moving through streets now familiar in a different way than during his years of homelessness. The city had not been transformed completely. Inequality persisted, struggle continued, systems still failed those most vulnerable. But spaces had opened for different possibilities, for connections that transcended traditional boundaries, for dignity to be recognized as a fundamental right rather than a privilege. As he rolled past shops closing for the night, nodding to vendors he knew by name, Eduardo reflected on the long, improbable journey from professor to homeless man, to corporate consultant to institute founder. Not a linear progression, but a complex spiral, each phase building on what came before, each loss containing unexpected seeds of growth. What had begun as a simple portrait, an artist seeing beyond surface to essence, had expanded into a movement that challenged how value was defined, how success was measured, how connection was fostered across profound differences. And at its heart remained the most fundamental truth Eduardo had discovered beneath the jacaranda tree, that being seen, truly seen in one's full humanity, was perhaps the deepest need of all. Not as a category or a problem or a symbol, but as an individual with inherent worth regardless of circumstance. That recognition, freely given and gratefully received, had been the first step on a journey that continued to unfold, not just for Eduardo and Vidal, but for all whose lives they had touched and would touch in years to come. Not an ending, but a continuing story of visibility, connection, and transformation, written not in grandiose gestures, but in countless small moments of genuine seeing, the invisible made visible, the disconnected brought into community, the forgotten remembered and valued, one person, one encounter, one recognition at a time. If a single moment of truly seeing someone can transform two lives, imagine what might happen if we all began to look more deeply, beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, beyond the comfortable barriers that separate us from those we consider other. Perhaps in that seeing lies the beginning of a world where no one remains invisible.